I want to greet especially our panelists, to Counselor Emilio Archila and Judge Eduardo Cifuentes. Unfortunately, due to a last-minute commitment, there is one speaker who cannot join us, but we are very pleased to have the presence of Mrs. Michaela Paulini from the Verification Mission of the United Nations. And of course, greetings to the moderator, Mrs. Maria Camila Moreno. It is a pleasure to be able to begin this session, Innovation in Transitional Justice, Colombia, and the pertinent sanctions. In Colombia, we see the peace process and the transitional justice with lots of hope, especially for the sanctions with a restorative approach. Switzerland has been working in this aspect in several contexts. We talk about the treatment of past following holistic understanding, which includes the pillars of truth, justice, reparation, and no repetition, just as in the integrated system in Colombia. We know how difficult it is to cope with the situation during an armed conflict, and it is even harder to turn this process into the construction of a peaceful future with a reconciled society. There are other examples of countries that have applied restorative justice, but the peace agreement between the Colombian state and the FARC guerrillas is unique and innovative. This is an agreement that is facing the consequences of the conflict in a comprehensive manner, where victims are at the core of the solution. So these characteristics are getting to all the measures of the agreement, including sanctions themselves. Sanctions will help Colombians to overcome the armed conflict with justice, and they also seek to build a future with the necessary guarantees to make sure that the conflict is not repeated. For that purpose, sanctions involve victims, those who are appearing at HIP, and all the different state institutions and the society at large. This is a comprehensive process. In this regard, I hope that the conversation today will allow us to understand what's the status of the process of the sanctions of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and how the different institutions at the state are cooperating in this context. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to the moderator, Maria Camila Moreno, the director of the International Center for Transitional Justice in Colombia. Maria Camila, the floor is yours. Thank you, Christine. Before beginning the conversation and passing the floor to our guest speakers, I would like to briefly remind you what these sanctions issue is, so that all the participants who are joining us here today can have the elements, common elements of understanding to determine what these own sanctions are. I would start by saying that this is perhaps one of the most innovative aspects of this design of the comprehensive system, and particularly the design of the special jurisdiction for peace, because these restorative sanctions, if we want to classify them in a more accurate way, are sanctions that do not include the jail time or prison time as we're normally used to saying when penalties are imposed after criminal liability processes are taking place. Normally the sanctions or the penalties include jail time. So the novel design establishes that whenever the persons accountable contribute to the full truth and they recognize their responsibility, they have as main benefit the possibility to have a sanction that it will also be the result of a process, a judicial process, rigorous process, which is genuine, but at the end of the day, it won't have that component of prison time. On the contrary, sanctions themselves will have two components that are really important. One, which may be called retributive, which is the main characteristic of the different sanctions of the ordinary justice, but in this time it does not include jail time or prison time, but the restriction of freedoms and rights. A second component, which is restorative, which includes what and the norm has been established, which are works or activities with a repair and restorative component. This component is more
which is
known
this is
as
the this component is known as the famous TOR, which is works and activities with a reparation content, because the purpose of these sanctions themselves, apart from materializing the reproach for the severe violations of human rights and to the humanitarian law committed during the conflict, they seek to restore the damage caused and also to repair in a symbolic and collective manner that damage, and also to set the grounds for reconciliation, which is what this country is pursuing. So these sanctions, not only do they have the purpose of punishing, but also to promote a dialogue among victims and the responsible parties around the construction of a future, an inclusive and fair future for all Colombians, men and women. In terms of sanctions themselves, this is for me to wrap up. This is the result of processes of contribution to peace. This is the condition, this is the core condition of these sanctions and of the recognition of responsibility, which by themselves are also part of this restoration process in a justice, in a restorative justice process. Taking this into account and knowing that that these sanctions will be the final outcome of the different processes currently undertaken by the jurisdiction and which will be undertaken in the upcoming years. I would like to introduce our speakers. Well, first of all, we have the president of Special Jurisdiction for Peace, Dr. Eduardo Cifuentes. Welcome. We also have with us the presidential counselor for the stabilization and consolidation, Dr. Emilio Archila. And then thirdly, but not less important, we also have the head of the legal division of the mission of verification of the United Nations, Michaela Paulini. We have prepared some questions, guiding questions for this discussion, this conversation, which will cover three aspects which are really important. On the one hand, the things having to do with the design and the mandate, is the jurisdictional mandate that HEB has, which is the entity responsible for imposing these sanctions. On the other hand, we have an important aspect, which is the operation, the operativity of sanctions themselves, which implies not only the jurisdiction, but also the different entities of the government and the state, which will also guarantee the possibility of the execution and the implementation of these sanctions. And then, thirdly, another important aspect that was included in the design and in the norm, which is the international component of verification and follow up of the compliance of these sanctions. So, to begin with, I would start by stating 3 points that, in my opinion, are really important to open up this discussion. Then I will pass the floor to each one of the speakers. You will first have 5 minutes for an initial intervention, and then we will delve into some of the topics. First of all, we would like to know from the perspective and work of each one of you what's been the progress and what's next in terms of the sanction system design. When I talk about the sanction system itself, I'm referring to all the different components which are part of the design and the implementation of these sanctions, such as, for example, topics like security, uh, uh, the maintenance, sustenance of the person's sanction during the time they're executing the sanctions, all these operational aspects that will allow for the effective execution of these sanctions. So the first one will be the progress and what's next. Then, secondly, from the perspective of each one of you, what, in your opinion, should be the main challenges of the enforcement and execution of sanctions themselves? We know that so far we have not we haven't seen a first ruling. Hopefully this will happen next year, so therefore we are in a preparation and design phase, but it is possible to identify those challenges that will imply the imposition of the sanctions. And then thirdly, what will be the conditions that these sanctions should have in the execution thereof in order to make sure that they're genuine and credible for the victims and for the society as a whole? As you well know, one of the most important aspects and this point has to do with communication and with the validation that the victims will and society as a whole will do on the seriousness and of the imposition and of the sanctions themselves, because at the end of the day, victims will be fundamentally, but also the society will be the ones who will evaluate if at the end of these processes and with these sanctions, justice has been served. I want to start by passing the floor to Dr. Eduardo Cifuentes by greeting you again very kindly. The floor is yours. The floor is yours for 5 minutes. Dr. Eduardo, are you there? He was there until just very recently. There he is. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with Maria Camila, Christine, and with the other guest speakers and Emilio Archila. In my first 5 minutes, I would like to express some thoughts, general um, uh, thoughts about the sanctions. The first thing I want to highlight is that this defines the transitional justice systems. The transitional justice investigates and determines where the persons liable and to enforce non-sanctionatory measures. And in either case, the exercise is one of is restorative justice. It is not just about indicating that this is going to offer the truth, but also reparation. And this is why from the beginning, the different areas and chambers have done their work. The first one has to do with the conceptualization, the due understanding of these aspects, then the relations that must be suggested with the national government and with the different entities having competence in their own responsibilities as well. no sanctions have been imposed so far, and therefore we are at the right time to introduce the operational and architectural aspects of these systems. I would say that apart from the conceptualization and the preparation and the meetings that have been sustained, I think that we're at a point where we can issue a more robust suggestions to the public, especially Dr. Emilio Jose Archila, so that we can understand what's the content and the scope of restorative justice. I prefer to talk about a restoration complex as a state policy that has different manifestations, which begin with the design, the implementation, the execution of the reparation measures, whether, in other words, those that make up the sanctions as and the other assumptions that to apply non-sanction measures. Along these lines, the sanctionatory complex is
Discúlpeme, doctor Eduardo.
Dr. Eduardo.
Andrés, ¿podría
Andres, could you please
Gracias, Andrés.
turn off your mic?
Vale.
So I was saying that as in regards to the restoration complex, we would be on day zero of creation. So with this suggestion, I would like to simply stop right there because I have a lot of elements that will explain the process, which have to do with the matter, so that I can hear perhaps those who are joining us and perhaps to give you more in-depth
Gracias, doctor
opinions.
Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Dr.
A
Eduardo.
continuación, le damos la palabra
We
al
will
doctor
pass the floor
Emilio
to Dr.
Archila.
Emilio Archila.
Cuéntenos usted cómo está viendo el tema, qué
Dr.
se ha
Emilio,
observado,
what are
qué
your
falta,
thoughts about this?
qué
What's the
retos.
process? What are the challenges?
Bueno, primero, muchísimas gracias por
Well,
esta,
first of all, thank you.
esta invitación.
Thank you for this invitation, and I would like to,
Reiterar, digamos,
I want to reiterate
el gigantesco
the huge
relevancia que
relevance that has been provided by the government, by the president to this debate, and especially to be able to share with those of you who are directly responsible. And my admiration, my respect, and my conviction that we are in the best hands at this time on the part who are leading the destiny of the HEP, indicating that Dr. Eduardo was so cautious. I don't want to be so, I'm really concerned that I may be very straight in terms of my ideas, but I want to honor, and I'm going to give you some thoughts that are more specific in this regard, to just to add some spice to this roundtable. The guideline that we have suggested in terms of in practical terms has to do with the fact that we notice that there is a material object in terms that will indicate what would be the purpose of the sanctions themselves, some conditions regarding the attendees and those who are prosecuted, which should refer to the compliance of these tasks entrusted to them, some conditions which must take place around these circumstances in terms of those sanctions in order to make sure that they become a reality. And I do agree with Dr. Eduardo and how important it is to process those conditions or the way they're processed in, so that not only with respect to victims, but the country itself, not only just each one of the sanctions, but the system, to make sure that the system complies with this function of giving us the transition needed between a state of violence and what we're all expecting to achieve as part of a non-violent state. Now, as regards the purpose of the sanctions, we believe that they are based on some of the 33,000 initiatives that were suggested by the communities and the municipalities having development plans with the territorial approach. Within this set of the 33,000 initiatives, I think that the ones that will accomplish the purposes that we have established in both the agreements and in the norms and in the rulings of the Constitutional Court are those that are in Pillar 8. Let's remember that PDFs have 8 chapters. One of them is chapter of reconciliation, or the ones that after being in some of the other chapters on the part of those who participated, they have that condition of reconciliation. We believe that above those, we have the different opportunities where those initiatives and those petitions will coincide, and they represent a high number with the collective reparations have been requested by the groups of victims and or those requests made in the plans of return of those who are will be benefited from the restitution. So the reasons are many, and they exceed the time that I have in this first minutes. But they come from the victims. They come. That's exactly what the victims are requesting as part of the reparation. They are framed within the most extensive chapters of implementation of the different agreements, and particularly the conditions of reconciliation of the different territories. The second part refers to the conditions in which uh, these works should be accomplished. This is a this pertains more to the responsibility of Dr. Eduardo, but I would mention some that, in my opinion, are quite relevant in the jurisprudence of the court. The restrictions that are taking place to the individual freedoms, they need to accomplish the different parameters that have been foreseen for these sanctions. So there is a huge challenge among the different special conditions that these type of sanctions have, understanding that restrictions that are on individual liberties or freedoms, they should be as credible as possible for the community at large. They need to comply with the standards of international law. And apart from these, they need to help us ensure that this transition movement is possible. And a particular point that not because it's too specific in terms of some of the appearing parties, it's important. It's the fact that my reading of the court ruling when referring to the loss of investiture, it highlighted that it was not a disabilities or inabilities or incompatibilities norm, and that those who were sanctioned in the Congress were not losing automatically their political position, but there was a possibility so that if the sanction makes it impossible to exercise those positions, then the person should depart or leave the Congress, and that will help a lot. As to the material conditions in order to comply with those judgments, I have two aspects. One, the court was very clear that in the exercise of this power, the jurisdiction, the judges shouldn't supply the other agencies of the state and the establishment of public policies, and therefore the fact of being there or being in line with the PEDET, that will help us a lot, quite a lot, because it will eliminate the temptation of doing recreation of how the constitution, the construction of the territory should take place, because they will be automatically included in something that the legislative and the international community have established from the no, from the coordination that I have to do among the different entities of a national order, the different departments and municipalities. doing things this way will make it even easier for the process to achieve that coordination. At this time, I'm in Florencia with all the secretaries of the governors or all the different majors, more than 50 national entities, and it is that coordination what we're currently doing. And the last comment that I have, which has to do with the verification, as as you will know, the president of the republic requested the Security Council of the United Nations to extend the mandate with which they have a verification mission in order for them to collaborate and justice with HIP in the verification of the different sanctions in terms of what they're conducting in their material conditions, and the truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition components. This is a work that also must be coordinated by the counselor's office, and we are working on the uh, to get something similar to the PEDET or something with the same content. So again, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Emilio. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting message where we'll have the opportunity to delve into these topics. I would like to pass the floor to Michaela. Michaela, you're there. Just to hear from your part, what are the reflections that have been done by the mission at this time, and which are the challenges in general, but particularly now in terms of verification? Michaela, welcome. The floor is yours.
Saludo para todos, para todas. Muchas gracias,
Thank you so
agradecimos
much. Greetings to all of
la
you.
oportunidad de
Thank you
abordar
for giving us
este
the
tema
opportunity to talk about
que la misión
such an important
considera
topic,
tan
which is
importante.
very important for the
Quisiera
mission.
empezar
I would like to
hablando
start
puntualmente
by
del hecho
talking
que
about the fact
todo lo que
that
hemos hecho, todos los avances
everything
que
that we
hemos
have
podido
done and all the
lograr
progress
se
that I
basan
can mention are
exclusivamente sobre el hecho
mainly
que tenemos
based
ahora un
on the
mandato
fact that at this time we have a
establecido por el
mandate, as
presidente.
Dr. Archila mentioned,
Presidente de la
the
República
President of the Republic
expresamente
asked, expressly
al
asked
Consejo de Seguridad
the
que
Security
esta
Council
ampliara el mandato
to
para incluir
expand the mandate
la
to
posibilidad
include the
también de la
possibility
verificación
of
para
verification or
sanciones
to
propias.
verify
En
the
este
sanction
sentido,
itself.
quisiera solamente definir
I would like to
para
define
todos los
first,
que nos escuchan
for those of you who are
qué es
hearing
el
us,
mandato de la misión. Básicamente
what's the
vamos
mandate of the mission?
a
The mission
verificar
will basically
la sanción
verify
propia en
the
sus dos
sanction itself
componentes,
into its
restricción
two
de
components, which is
libertad
the
y
restriction of freedom in
seguramente va a
of everyone.
verificar la
So it will
sanción
also verify
de
the
todos
sanction
los
of all
comparecientes,
the
que
different
son FARC,
appearing
Fuerza
parties,
Pública,
whether FARC,
integrante
law
de la
enforcement,
República o
or
agente de Estado no integrante de la Fuerza Pública,
state
ejerce
agents who are not members of the law
y
enforcement,
obviamente
and of
la
course
importancia
the
que nos da el
importance
mandato de
uh,
verificar las
that
sanciones de
the
dos
mandate is giving
componentes,
us
dos
to
aspectos
verify
distintos,
the two components or
sería
two
la
aspects, which would be
implementación
the
del
implementation
sancionado
on the
del
part
mismo
of the
y además
sanction,
de las
person sanction,
condiciones
and the
necesarias
conditions
para que
needed
esta implementación se
to make
lleve a
sure that
cabo.
this
Ahí
implementation takes place.
básicamente
So
estamos
this
hablando de
is
pues,
basically, we're talking
también
about the different
incluye
actors,
obviamente
including
el Estado que como
the
nos ha
state,
explicado el doctor
which,
Archila
as indicated by
un
Dr.
gran
Archila, will be
actor en la
a huge actor
ejecución de las
in the
sanciones.
execution of the
En
sanction.
este sentido,
So in this regard,
estamos trabajando con todos los
we're
actores.
working with
Así
all the different
hemos
actors.
tenido
So we have
bastantes
had
reuniones muy
we have
constructivas
held meetings, very constructive
con la
meetings
oficina del doctor
with the
Archila.
office of Dr.
Realmente
Archila
en
on
busca
the
de
possibility
la financiación
to get the funds or
y
the
del monitoreo
financing
que ellos
and
solicitan
monitoring that they will
de los
conduct
proyectos
of the
productivos,
different
perdón,
productive
proyectos
projects,
restaurativos, disculpen.
I'm
Y
sorry,
también
the
estamos
restoration
trabajando muy
projects.
a la
And
mano
we're
de
also
forma
working hand in hand
multidisciplinaria, en particular con
with
la
HEP,
dirección
particularly
con el
with the
conocimiento de la
section of
Contraloría
recognition
para
and with the
definir
Secretariat's office to define
el mecanismo de monitoreo y verificación
the monitoring mechanism and the verification of the sanction itself in within the different elements in terms of who is going to be part of this mechanism, its subjective, the objectives and functions as well. So I think that we're quite we have progressed a lot in this work. I know that there are many challenges, and one of the first challenges that I can mention at this time is that we're going to have a lot of entities that will be actors, important actors at the time of the execution of the sanction. We're thinking of the victim organizations, the representatives of the person sanctioned, the state part, the different local entities and regional entities that will be involved. So a first challenge will have to do with the coordination of all the different entities. This is because we have the prosecutors, the ombudsman office. So we will have to interact. We will have to interact or organize this articulation with them. Of course, there are other two elements that, in our opinion, are a challenge. One is the funding of the restoration project to the extent that once the sanction begins, the person sanctioned would have to continue actively. We need to establish this bill of restoration without continuity solution. So before the sanction itself, which may be a 2-year sanction, we need to project, we need to have a restorative project and the funding thereof through years. So I think that this could be a good challenge. And the last one could be also security. How can we know if we are witness of the fact that whoever participates or whoever says the truth is already having a security problem by itself? When the person that has said the truth and has recognized that responsibility will be sanctioned, because the freedom will be restricted, even if that for that person and his or her family can be targeted uh, uh, due to security reasons, apart from the fact that we need to include in this process the fact that many victims already live in a very difficult situation where the security in places where security is very difficult. So the two elements together will create for sure a security alert that is really high, which is something that we need to face or address before before the sanction is issued. So so these are my first points, and thank you so much. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you. You have indicated very important points, which are very specific and quite operational. I would like to go back to Dr. Fuentes so that he can extend a little bit more to what has been mentioned. And particularly, I would like to ask Dr. Cifuentes to talk about the restoration complex on the one hand. But apart from this, I would like to hear or to suggest if he can give us his thoughts on what could be the impact of sanctions themselves in terms of these restorative objectives and reparation objectives. And then on the other hand, I would like to invite you to give us some thoughts on perhaps one of the most interesting aspects, but which are also quite complex, which is this dialogue between victims and the persons responsible around the sanction proposal, which is in fact a condition in the process. This is part of the whole process to get to the sanction itself, that but which without a doubt will require a lot of caution. And I think that this is also part of what you have been working on, which in this restoration complex. So, Dr. Eduardo, the floor is yours. Thank you. I I abstained from expanding in order to hear more in detail the concepts of those who are joining me in this seminar, especially the position of Dr. Archila and the position of Michaela. And and what I was looking for is precisely that. I mean, here that other people, here other people other than hell than HEP, to indicate the challenges that we are facing. We have the international community joining us. And a challenge in terms of what has to do with the Colombian state in particular, it compromises basically a lot of entities. And this is a coordination, articulation, and integration challenge. And now, in terms of this articulation, it is important to have the leadership of Dr. Emilio Archila. I know him quite well, and I know of his qualities. This is something that he has shown in the country with the development of the PIDET. And I think that this we will be facing the implementation of the first major challenge. I'm going to give you some uh, concepts. At least uh, eh, I'm going to go into further detail. In the regulatory system of the special justice for peace, we have a retributory component which is reflected in the sanction of imprisonment for 20 years as a sanction, which is the highest number of years for the maximum responsible who assumes no responsibility or contributes and who's defeated in the court. It highlights that in that case, the sanction is the classic sanction. So what's the responsibility of the Colombian state? To administer and to undertake a prison system. So in this case, the transitional judge issues a ruling, and the support expected from the public administration is the one that takes place when a public policy is implemented with the organic and administrative and financial and budgetary and verification processes, which is the prison system. That's the classic one, but it coexists in the regulatory system of the jurisdiction. There is the sanction and the strict reparation as the reflection of the restorative justice. This is a restorative justice anchored in the political constitution and developed through statutory laws, and which is explained sufficiently by the Constitutional Court. And this restorative justice also implies sanctions and reparation measures. Sanctions and this type of sanctions not only require a prison system, but they do require a restorative complex, which is the functional equivalent of the prison system, in which uncovers the obligation of the state to sanction conducts that internationally deserve should be reproached, such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, which lie on the international law and which pertain to this jurisdiction as well. The positive right indicates that if a conduct determination is made, it is concluded that a criminal event, there is a consequence that implies the sanction. The restorative system has a sanction, which is the sanction itself, and it also have a consequence mechanism of another device, which is the non-sanctionatory measures, which include reparation. This system of this system or restorative complex is not the responsibility of the special jurisdiction for peace. It implies that this corresponds to an obligation or to a duty of the Colombian state. And this is why a first conclusion that I can give you is that this is not just a residual aspect to the PEDET, but to the contrary, the PEDET are one component among others of the restorative complex. The restorative complex demands that the Colombian state, through the articulation of the council, because this is the current setup of the public administration, but this will involve several public administrations. We would have what if we have other agencies apart from the stabilization agency. We will also have other entities. We would also have government and departmental and local figures, but the obligation is in charge of the state. A different thing is that along the way we can articulate the efforts and the supports that we hope to get, which have to take place of decentralized entities. So this is about creating a bank of projects that will
Perdón, alguien que ya se llama iPhone CMT podría, por favor.
somebody called us iPhone. Can you please turn off your microphone? Thank you. So therefore, we require a bank. So there has to be a manifestation in terms of project. Some projects are underway, other projects can be created from the beginning, others can be adapted, as in some of them, not all of them, can be adapted. But the fact is that it mainly corresponds and fundamentally to the Colombian state to provide the projects which will indicate who have to pay as a penalty, a sanction, or who have to assume a reparation mechanism as a waiver of the criminal action by the state. And I will refer to this next. This complex would have then the set of projects or with the different characteristics which have to be compatible with the terms of the rulings and with the terms of those resolutions where having no sanctionatory, like the waiver to the criminal action. They need to adapt to the theological process, which involves the people appearing and the victims and the justice itself, which is the one that will have the last word to say. It is not about a simple support to the person appearing at a given time, because it may convey a process more than the support. This is about the insertion of these persons in this, or the involvement in these processes, and also to consider the gender approach, territorial approach, the victim approach, a geo-referencing, more knowledge of where is the highest number of victims. And it is not just about taking today the current projects to see which will adapt to the current projects. On the contrary, this is a different dynamic. So this can actually be a part of these processes, but the most important thing are the ones having to do with the articulation with the transitional justice, with the public administration, national administration, in charge of the restorative complex. So this articulation will be based on a very dynamic group led by Dr. Achila and some representatives of transitional justice in order to determine the projects to make a territorial articulation. I want to indicate that the highest persons accountable for the worst crimes are subjected to their own sanction, and this own sanction does not require in order to undertake the any people appearing can be inserted in a project. Therefore, the restorative complexes has to be undertaken be- because we can have several projects going in the same direction. But what happens, Dr. Emilio, with those persons who have participated, who have executed, and who are part of crimes that are not part of an or that cannot be pardoned, or which are the worst crimes, which indicate that they are the highest responsible. So what we call who are undetermined participants. These persons and the national and international context should be subjected to criminal actions or sanctions as such. However, the constitutional regulation and the criminal transitional legislation uh, indicates a reparation, and they can establish a very transcendental measure in the competence of the jurisdiction, which is the waiver of the criminal action. So let's pay attention, which is a waiver of the criminal action due to war crimes, due to crimes against humanity and genocide crimes. They cannot be pardoned, and they are subjected to these reparation measures in order to contribute to the truth. So in this case, this is not just for those who will receive a penalty, but for those who will be receiving a non-sanctionatory measure. And in this case, I would say that there's lack of clarity in terms in the international system of the UN, also internally, and it's the fact that the reparation measures are only attributable to those who will be sanctioned. So if we follow the orders recently issued, for example, the first one on kidnapping, we have less than 10 people who could at some point in time be candidates to this process. However, when we talk about those who have participated in these crimes, not with that level of responsibility, but also with a sufficient level to receive a sanction, the number is higher in that case. And the following months, I'm just going to give you this information in relation to case 003, the different areas. This indicates 350 military persons and they need to tell the truth, and they need to assume a reparation, which is and based on this process, they need to give a criminal sanction, otherwise it will be scandalous, both domestically or internationally. Uh, uh, these type of crimes of like homicide with no reparation and without truth, those are two different requirements. I cannot commit to figures at this time. If you want to have at least one figure that is hypothetical, the maximum responsible are not that more than 4,000. And that is going to be produced immediately. Actually, even before the sanction itself, we could have these type of processes in order to have an extinguishment of liability, or the most severe transcendental one of all of them, a waiver to the criminal act for these crimes that cannot be pardoned or forgiven. So the absence uh, of has been the chamber who is responsible for establishing these criminal sanctions. They're the ones who will be ordering this type of ruling. So we need to include as well an actor of the greatest importance in transitional justice, which is the one with having to do with legal situations, and then we need to include a character that apparently is unknown, which is responsible as well for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide crimes, which could be a candidate to a waiver of the criminal action. Where so this is the most important part of the liability. This both the sanction itself and the strict reparation measure as pre-assumption for the waiver of criminal action. This demands being able to act through this type of dialogue with the intervention of victims and the peering parties, and where the head judge will play a not a mediation but jurisdiction position. So I reiterate, this is not about the it is not just the support to the candidate of the sanction itself, who dares to say that I'm going to repair by doing such and such thing. That's not the one that decides this. Is at the end of the day the section of the court or the court of definition of legal actions, uh, and they can actually follow by the jurisdiction, and they can actually be modified. So this is the essential part, in my opinion. This is the most important part of the restorative justice. This is where those who have been affected by the damage and the authors of these damages, they meet in in a justice setting through a dialogue. This is if this is successful, we're going to actually try to rebuild the social connections. We're going to have the possibility to impact in the most important areas where they have managed when we have the different sectors, and therefore this has to be established in terms of the restorative justice. So they need to comply with with this function. Is not residual. It's not to see what is useful for what, but it has to do with this. So these measures are measures that will also target at complying with the peace agreement. The peace agreement in a rural and comprehensive manner, and with the social and economic aspects of the communities in the chapter of the solution to the illegal drugs. When we're discussing, these are the type of chapters. So we need to list that these sanctions and the contents need to be useful with the transforming objective, which is one of the core ideas of restorative justice. So the challenge in this case is with this process, if it is just to achieve this type of process with those persons, we wouldn't have to create this. So thank you, Dr. Eduardo. Very interesting.
Doctor Emilio, se le multiplicaron los comparecientes de
Very challenging. And because at the end of the day, as you have mentioned, Dr. Eduardo, apart from those who will be paying the sanction itself, then we have this regime of conditionality, which is transversal to the HEP, and which is forcing those who did not have any conclusive participation to contribute to peace. But I think that more than a challenge, I think that this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity because we're talking about the possibility to guide the action of the state towards the most affected communities and the regions most greatly affected, towards transformation of the different actors that have said that the conflict remains there. And but there are two elements that I would like you to share your thoughts, which came up in in this conversation. And after looking at this in this perspective of the restorative complex, and I would like to hear your opinion on this idea. which is on the one hand the challenge of coordination, the interinstitutional coordination, all the different state and government entities in the upcoming 10 years, because it is clear that this is not something that will be exhausted with this government or this administration. And this will imply a sustained effort and a very important one so that the diverse national entities and territorial entities concur in a coordinated and efficient manner to make sure that this becomes a reality and that the sanctions can be actually executed. You spoke about the PDETA scenario, and this was contemplated in the agreement, but one of the scenarios for to identify the possible projects and to implement these sanctions and these works and activities outside the sanction. So one thing is coordination.
y también se ha señalado aquí, doctor Emilio, es el de la
Another
financiación.
important aspect is the funding and the effort that the Colombian state has to do in the upcoming years in order to guarantee that this becomes a reality. Because for sure we will have a horizon of 10 years of sanctions,
con aún mayor fuerza.
but even if we gain more force, or so I would say that the reparation that they need to do to those persons appearing, and which are the vast majority, who at the end of the day will not get a sanction because they didn't have a conclusive participation. What do you think about these challenges, Dr. Emilio?
Muchas gracias y nuevamente,
Thank you again.
digamos, este es un ambiente en el que
And I think that this is an environment
me
where
siento muy reconfortado de no estar
I'm recomforted that I am working
requiere de estos niveles
as a lawyer that requires this level of sophistication in the executive.
se necesita comprender
You need to understand
es más ejecutar.
this, but I think it's about executing. So I think that
De ilusión que
I'm filled with hope that these discussions
el nivel de
will require the level of analysis of all all the presenters are indicating.
en, respecto de las preguntas, yo diría
With respect to the questions, I would say the following.
gran expectativa
The great expectation, in my opinion, and I'm talking
a título
about on a personal level, is that justice needs to accomplish its function of being transitory.
y ese es un reto gigantesco.
And I think that that's a huge challenge that we have.
La violencia,
Violence, all types of violence, or the different, we all know this, we have different details, we have different specificities that are very specific to each country, society, or every moment through time. Look at the Colombian case
dentro de muchas otras
within many other cases which differ from others, where Colombians, once violence is overcome, I don't think that there's nothing else that we need to get used to live forever or perpetually. We do not have to get used to living with different regions. We have different religions around which violence was delving into. We do not need to get used to different ethnical groups because it was the FARC people. They were not the ethnical groups, but were making the difference. So this condition of transitionality, in my opinion, what this means is that all we need to exist in some moment in time. We need to accomplish a purpose. And then from this point on, Colombia needs to be able to live peacefully, understanding this as the lack of violence. So that's my opinion. And I'm not saying this only with respect to the transitional justice in its components or the documents of legality which are governing what we're currently doing. Therefore, the success of the different territories and the regulation we may have accomplished our purpose and we may end up disappearing.
En esa medida,
So in this regard,
el propósito general
the
que
purpose,
deberían
the
cumplir
general purpose
las
that
sanciones en todos los
that
niveles
sanctions should
de
accomplish at all the different levels
es de dotar tanto a las
is
víctimas como a la
is to
sociedad
provide the
de los
victims and
elementos
society with
espirituales
the
y elementos
spiritual
materiales
and material
necesarios para
elements that they
haber
need
dejado eso
in order
en el pasado.
to leave this on
Creo
the
que
past.
es importante
And I
que no
think it
se
is
debe
really
intentar
important not to give up to the
crear
temptation
condiciones que
to
puedan ser
create
aplicadas
conditions
a
that could be
situaciones en el
applied to other
pasado que son
situations or other
evolutivas
conditions
y hay
in
un
evolution. And in that case, there's a huge challenge.
en términos de
Now, in
irnos
terms
en los lineamientos
of following
de
the
los
guidelines
proyectos
and the different projects
que describía al
that
comienzo,
were
con
that I
estas
was describing
características
at
y
the
estas
beginning with these
condiciones,
characteristics and
tenemos
these conditions,
140.
we have
Es
140.
decir, nosotros ya tenemos
In other words,
identificados
we have
140
identified
proyectos
140
de
projects that
material
could be the material
de
object
de las sanciones que
of the
cumplen con todas las
sanctions,
condiciones
which accomplish or comply with all the conditions
habrían previsto.
that had been
Concuerdo con
foreseen.
el magistrado
And
Eduardo
according
en el sentido
to
de que
Judge Eduardo,
en esos, como lo describía al comienzo, no
that
estamos
in
identificando
those that I described at the
antecedentes
beginning,
en
it's not
todas
that they
estas
are
condiciones.
identified in the
Estas
PIDA, but that they have other conditions. So
actividades que
these
se
are
realizan
the
en
regular processes
instituciones están
that
sujetos
involve
a las
the
mismas
different
que se
interventions.
realizan
This includes
en
the
los
rights of
protocolos de
victims
identificación y en las circunstancias de
with the
reparaciones
circumstance
reparaciones
in
colectivas.
terms of the
Eh,
preparation.
me alegraba mucho, digamos,
I
como lo
was
describe el doctor
very
Eduardo,
pleased in
porque
terms of
no
what
solamente
Dr.
es una
Eduardo has mentioned,
posibilidad,
because
sino
this
que
is not just a possibility of what
los
has already
componentes están
happened, that
involucrados
former
y las
competents are
normas que están
really
proponiendo.
involved.
Nosotros tenemos a la Agencia de Reincorporación
We
también
have
de
the agency of reincorporation and the different
y en estos
coordination.
momentos ya
And at
hay
this time
de esas iniciativas,
of those
son
initiatives,
iniciativas que han pedido
which have been
las diferentes
requested by the different
proyectos
victims
de estas
within
condiciones
within the
están
planning
asumidas
processes,
por
which have been assumed by
por
by
las
the former
direcciones
competents. In the three ones that we have
se han
done,
realizado en
they
conjunto
have been
con víctimas y
conducted
con personas de la
as
comunidad,
victims and
dando
as part of the community,
efecto.
which is expanding to other processes. So
Entonces yo creo que la
I
función en
think
general
that
es una función que tiene
the
que ser una función
function in general,
permitir que haya
it needs to allow
haber firmado
to making transit between the signature, the implementation.
en cuanto a la
Now, as
materialidad,
to the materiality,
comentaba, tenemos ya el
as I
banco de
mentioned,
140 proyectos
we already have a bank
condiciones
of
específicas,
130
ya tenemos
projects.
ejercicios
As to the practical conditions that we have among the former combatants
involucrados y yo creo
who
que
have been involved, and I think that
esos
this
frutos y esas
has
acciones.
been fruitful and they have
Términos de
served the different
coordinación,
conditions. Now, in terms of the coordination
permítanme
that will
compartir
allow,
con ustedes
allow
algunas
me to share with
que
you
hemos
a
tenido
vision that we have
en
had
todos los frentes,
in all the
frente
different
de cómo
fronts
planear para las
in
víctimas,
terms of
cómo
how to
planear la
plan this with
reincorporación,
victims, how
cómo
to plan
planear
the
los PEDs, cómo
recorporation,
planear la
how to plan the
substitución
PEDET
voluntaria.
or the
Y
voluntary
yo no creo
substitution.
que haya
And I
una
don't
entidad
think that there is
ni
an
alguna persona
entity or any
ni
person,
siquiera Superman, que sea
not even
capaz de
Superman, who
coordinar
can
muchas entidades
coordinate
públicas.
a lot of public
Es
entities.
imposible de hacer.
This is
Entre
something
otras razones
impossible to do,
porque los
among other
servidores
reasons,
públicos
because
tenemos
public
esta
servants,
maldito
we
ego
have
que hace todo muy
this
difícil.
ego, and
Entonces,
it makes things really
la
difficult.
coordinación
So the
será muy
coordination
viable cuando
is
existan,
viable
en mi opinión,
by both the
no sea una
coordinator,
entidad o una
as long as
persona,
the coordinator is not
sino
an entity or a person, but if it's a good plan.
entonces cuando uno encuentra que
So
hay una
when you
coordinación
find
robusta
that
que
there is a
incluye
robust coordination that may have a lot of
a cada
components,
entidad o a cada
on
servidor
each
público
entity or
es
public
fácil
servant, it is easy for
vincularse
that person to
manteniendo
engage
siempre
to that process by
las
maintaining
condiciones,
its
pero
his
también
or
nos
her own
incluye en algo
identity.
que es un poco más
But in my
grande.
opinion, this is something that is can be actually more
Esta reunión que
relevant.
hemos tenido particularmente
This is basically the strategy that we had in the implementation of the PEDET.
Entonces,
So
si se trata de una obra
if
de
it is
infraestructura,
about an infrastructure work, if we need to build a bridge,
ese puente
we
puede
need to
o el
know
nombre
that
o de la
this
consejería o del
will be
ministerio
in the name of the counselor's office or the ministry,
dependiendo de las situaciones.
and this will
Puente puede
depend
ser un puente de la gobernación, puede ser un puente de la
on the
consejería,
governor's office or
todos esos
international
puentes al
cooperation.
final del
But
día
this
van a
is
hacer
this at the
sentido
end of the day
en función de
will
toda la
make
estructura
sense
vial de una región.
and within the infrastructure
En lo
of
que
a region.
observa el doctor
Whereas,
Eduardo
as indicated by
en
Dr.
ese
Eduardo
dibujo organizacional,
in this
esa representación
organizational
la tiene
drawing,
en la consejería donde yo trabajo y es muy
and
importante y
then
distinto de que es esta consejería. Yo
this has to do with the
trato
counselor's office, and
de
therefore
que eso se
I would
fortalezca en lugar
make sure that
de
these
que se
become
busque debilitar.
stronger instead of
Tener
being
más de un
limited.
coordinador
Having
en
more
el
than one
territorio
coordinator in the
es un
territory,
desastre. Las
it
micrológicas
makes a
terminan
mess.
siendo
The
un
micrologics
desastre
end up being a disaster.
entonces, yo diría para
So I
eso
would say that for this
una
purpose,
invitación a que todos conozcan un
we
poco
want
los
to invite you
detalles
all
de las
to know
reglas
in
que rigen
detail
cada
these
implementación
type of planning that will allow each person to
de
have
las
their
áreas.
own
Entonces, yo le pido
protagonism
que haga su labor,
and to
pero que
conduct their own work.
formen
But at the end of the day, they
una
need to become
implementación que
part
va
of an implementation
más allá.
that will go beyond
En
that.
términos de
So
financiación,
in terms of funding,
digamos, lo que no ocurrió, porque no
what
hubiera
didn't
pasado,
happen
es
or
que
what couldn't
firmados los
happen
acuerdos
is
y
that as
hechas las
after signing the
promesas,
agreements and
los
after
recursos
doing the
nunca llegaron.
promises of the resources were there.
Entonces, ustedes han oído
So
que
you have heard
parte de las veces en que
that part of the
digamos, el
times
control, los
where
periodistas
control entities and
están
journalists have
están
affected us,
desfinanciando la
they
paz
normally say
cuando
that they're
se hace ese ejercicio
taking away the
es una
funding of peace.
comparación
When you judge this is like making a comparison
conseguido hasta
between
ahora
what
y
we
un
have
monto
achieved so far,
de
which is
plata
a huge amount of
para
money
los que
for all the different
y un
fronts,
ejercicio
and
académico
an
previo
academic
a eso
exercise that
de
was
que
done
hiciéramos la labor
before
y
the
qué
work was
plata
conducted in terms of how
necesitaríamos
much money will be
cumplir con los
needed
acuerdos.
in order to
Eso que
contribute to
está
the
en
agreements.
marcos
So this is what we
fiscales
have in
que
the
están
fiscal
en
framework, or
complejo
what we
financiero
have in the funding
los
of
acuerdos
complex. And so this is what
hemos
we would
logrado
need. So we
en
have
todos los
achieved,
sitios
we have made sure that all the different
consenso
items
y cuando
can
digo
go
consenso es
up.
todos los presupuestos han ido
And I'm
en
talking,
ascenso
and all the different
en la
budgets are
en la
ascending,
pandemia.
even in the
En la
pandemic,
medida en que
to the
alguna
extent
propuesta o alguna similar
that it may be
fuera
similar
efectivo en los PEDET, en los planes de recuperación
in terms of what we have been mentioning
en las
about the
reparaciones
PEDET
colectivas, en los planes
or
nacionales sectoriales, en los
the
programas
sectoral
de
plans or
sustitución,
the
todos tienen
substitution plans.
unos
They
componentes
all
muy,
have
muy
a
significativos y de
component
ahí esas
that are
competencias
quite
son
significant,
mayores.
and we have
No
more
tendríamos
policies.
que
So
repetir
first, we wouldn't have to
los
repeat
presupuestos.
the
Segundo,
assumptions, and
que
then
algunos de los
secondly,
esfuerzos
each one of the
sea
efforts
eficiente.
would
Yo
become
en ese
efficient.
sentido
And in this regard,
contarles
I could
un
tell you that
esto
there is a topic that is
la unidad
purely
de
illustrative.
víctimas
And the
no
victims
está andando como
unit,
parado en
the
alto,
victims unit is not
está llevando
is
esa
not
línea
separating. I'm
todo
talking
el
about the
sector
counselor's office,
fronterizo y esa es la vocería
and
que
that's
estoy llevando.
what I'm referring to in
Este
this
equipo está
case.
diseñado
The
para
victims unit has
que la
designed the
equipo
methodology
reparador
that will
tiene que prestar
provide a
atención a unas
reparation
intervenciones
nature to some
que antes
interventions that at
no tenían
first
precisamente para
did
poder
not have
establecer ese
that.
concepto
And this is a
de
concept
la
of
transición.
materiality of transition.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, doctor Emilio. Creo que ha
Thank
sido
you,
muy
Dr. Emilio. I think that you have been quite, I think your explanation has been quite
y quisiera entonces
illustrative. And I
preguntarle,
would like
Micaela,
to ask Michaela,
pues un poco ya dibujado el panorama
after having a clear picture of the
ya
panorama,
estos
um,
140
I mean, what we have
proyectos y
so
el
far in
proyecto
terms of the
inicial
140
pero también
projects
en el
I
alcance
initially identified,
que
but also the
está en el
scope
que viene trabajando la
on
jurisdicción
which
para
the
tener este
jurisdiction
complejo
is working
restaurativo
to have
más allá
this
de las
restoration
sanciones
complex that goes beyond
y en
the
el que estamos
sanctions,
pues
and
diferentes
where we look at different components that to a certain extent have to be articulated. What do you think about the challenges of the monitoring of the sanction on the one hand? And then on the other hand, I would like to hear your perspective on what's the added value of the international monitoring, because in the design or the agreement, it provided that the international monitoring that does not replace the role, the jurisdictional role of the judges who are the ones that, who at the end of the day analyze if the sanction is accomplished or not. There was a sense of providing more credibility to these sanctions, of course, within a complex political context as the Colombian one is. What are your thoughts about this?
Sí, muchas gracias, Camila.
Thank you so much, Camila.
Obviamente
Well,
sale
of course,
evidente de esta
it is
conversación que uno
evident
de
from this
los
conversation
mayores
that one of the major
transición sanitaria
challenges
y de la
of the
justicia
sanction
transicional
itself and of
como
transitional
implementada en
justice
Colombia es una
as
propuesta
implemented in Colombia
novedosa
is
por ende,
novel, and therefore
obviamente estamos todos
we
como
are all
empezando
starting the process,
tratando de
and
comprender
we're trying to
cómo se
understand how
puede
is it
hacer, por un
that
lado, la sanción, su
we can do the
implementación,
sanction, its
la
funding,
situación
the
de seguridad
situation
que
of
se
security
traslada, obviamente, a los comparecientes,
to
beneficios
for the appearing persons, and
sancionadamente, entonces,
I mean for
y
the
por nuestro lado,
claimants,
a la
and
verificación.
for
La
the
primera vez,
verification. I think that this is the
solamente
first time
en
globally that there is a
Estados Unidos
sanction
una
in
misión de la
itself, but there's
ONU
also a mission
haga una
of the
verificación
UN
de
that
una
is doing a
sanción.
verification
Entonces,
of a sanction.
seguramente
So for sure,
uno de los desafíos
one of the
va a ser
challenges that we can
bastante
see in
amplio.
this
Para
case is
nosotros,
quite
lo que
ample.
tenemos en
So
este
to
desafío
us, what we
es
have in this
el
challenge
conocimiento que
is the
tenemos
knowledge
en
that we
verificación
have in
ciudadana.
terms of
Tenemos
the
muchísimos años de
verification. We have
experiencia
lots of
también en
years of
verificaciones un poquito
verification
más
of
complicadas
a
de
little bit more complicated situations,
verificación de un cese al fuego.
verification
Entonces,
of a
es una
ceasefire. So we have a methodology that is very strong,
seguramente
um,
enfrentar
which will give us the basis to
un nuevo
face
reto. Estamos
this new challenge.
manejando la
We're
metodología
managing
que pueda
the
aplicarse
methodology
también
that
con
can be
la
applicable,
creación de la
a
sanción
verification of the sanction
y una sanción propia.
and a
Eso es una cosa.
sanction
La
itself.
primera
So
vez que
these are two.
verificamos una
The
sanción
first
y
time that we
la
verified the
nuevamente.
sanction, and the first
Un
time that we
reto
do verify a
seguramente
known sanction. So another challenge that we will be discussing perhaps
también en otros espacios
in other
la
spaces
sanción
is the
propia
fact that
recae
the
sobre
sanction will lie on
diferentes
uh,
sujetos.
for
Nosotros en
different
este
projects.
momento nos hemos
At this
concentrado en
time,
la
we are
población, en los
focusing on a
bebés
population, on a universe
reintegrados. Ahora
of
vamos a
reintegrated
ampliar
persons, and we're going to
que va a
expand it
incluir
to a
agentes
universe
de
that will
salud
include
pública
law
y agentes
enforcement and members of
no
the law
incluidos en la salud
enforcement,
pública y terceros.
and
Y
those who are
esto,
not included in the law enforcement and
por la
third
misión, pero
parties.
seguramente por la misión va a
But for
ser
sure, based on the
una
mission,
expansión que nos
this
va
may be an
a
expansion that will give us
la necesidad de articularnos
or come up with the
con
need
otros
to
actores
articulate
más.
with other additional
La última
actors.
diría
Then the
que
last
es un
one, in my
desafío
opinion, as a
importante
important challenge
seguramente la
is that
territorialidad.
for
La
sure
misión
the
va a ser
territoriality,
nosotros
this will
estamos
be
bien
territorial. We
posicionados
are well
en el sentido
positioned
que estamos
to the
obviamente en
extent that we
muchos
are
lados.
in many places.
Vamos a estar presente
We're going to
haciendo
be
esta
present
verificación muy
doing this
rigurosa, muy
verification that will be very
exhaustiva
rigorous
en el
and
campo. Y
constructive,
este
and we're going to do it
desafío que
online on the field.
que los desafíos se
And
van a
and this
crear
is and there
y
will be
esperamos
challenges,
que
and hopefully
vamos a estar acompañados
we
de
can be
otros
supported
actores
by
en el
other
terreno para que
actors
ahí
on the
no
field so that
todo en Bogotá pueda
so
ser visto,
n-
¿no? Resuelto.
so that not everything will be resolved from Bogota. So of course,
Los avantajes que tiene
the
la sanción,
advantages,
¿cierto?
the
Tener una
advantage
misión que
of
hace
having
esa
a mission that
verificación
will do a
sobre la sanción
verification
propia,
on the sanction
creo que
itself,
será
I think
primariamente el
that
hecho
it will be
que
primarily be
la
the
misión fue
fact that
creada por el
that the
Consejo de
mission was
Seguridad,
created
hemos
by the
creado
Security Council. We have
accountabilidad.
there's unanimous approach. So everyone wanted us to be there where the sanction is going to be implemented so that we can report to the Security Council itself how is the sanction being implemented. So in this possibility to establish a bridge between them, between the situation in Colombia, and particularly in this case, the implementation of the sanction itself in the international community in New York. And this presence of an international actor, an impartial actor, in our opinion, this is going to create more trust or convey more trust. Uh, it's going to create further trust in the things we're doing and what the HEP is doing and within its function, what the state is implementing. And this is what we're verifying, not only from the victims, for sure from the Colombian society at large. And for sure, the fact that we are present as in the territory, we will be there where the sanction is being implemented. And I think that these can imply a good advantage and a support for all the actors who perhaps do not have such a huge territorial presence in order to gain access to very difficult territories with the support of the mission in case of verification of the sanction itself. So I think that these will be the parts that I wanted to share with you in terms of this agenda. Thank you, Michaela. I think that we have addressed the main topics. We have roughly 13 minutes to wrap up because we need to be very strict in time because they were with Switzerland. And but if you agree with this, Christine, I would like to have a very short round. I would like each one of you to use 3 minutes to give us a last message, some last thought. And I would like invite you as well to suggest or how do you think that the international community can contribute to making sure that the sanction system works and uh, and that it complies with the major objective of rebuilding trust of victims in the state and to making sure that the Colombian state complies with its obligation to investigate and to uh, prosecute these crimes. I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Emilio first.
Bueno, pues nuevamente muchas gracias.
Well, again, thank you very much.
Quisiera resaltar
I would like to highlight
ese énfasis que
with that emphasis
nos lo pone
that you have given
no hemos tratado, por
in
ejemplo,
topics that we have not dealt with.
lo tocó.
Perhaps Judge Cifuentes did mention, and it has to do with pedagogy.
Este es un proceso
This
innovador, no
is an
solamente en
innovative
Colombia,
process, not only
sino en
globally, but
Colombia.
also in
No
Colombia.
podemos
And I think that we cannot,
las
let's not
dificultades
forget
que ha
the
tenido de
difficulties
entendimiento, de
it
aceptación
has had in terms of
Luego,
receptivity, understanding, acceptance.
poder
So
llevar
then
a los
being
países,
able to illustrate the
ilustrar
country
a las
or
víctimas,
illustrate the victims to make
cada uno de
sure
los
that
colombianos que
each
tiene
one of
unos
the Colombians
expectativas respecto al
having
cumplimiento de esos
expectations with
objetivos,
respect to the
nosotros
compliance of these objectives.
pensamos,
So
yo
to
veo
become
que la
familiar with this,
relevancia
to
es
me,
gigantesca.
that there will be a huge relevance in that case. So I
Estamos a
think
tiempo
that
y
we're
tengo
in the right
algo
time, and I
que
and
debo hacer por
and I
mi
must
sector en la
recognize
medida en que
that to
a
the
los Cifuentes
extent
y la
that
JEP recientemente han
the
abierto
judges,
otro
Cifuentes and HEP have
espectro de
opened
personas
this additional
con unas
spectrum of
condiciones
people who will
distintas
have
respecto
different conditions with
de los
respect
crímenes que a todos nos parecen los
to the
más
crimes
horrorosos. Ahí
that
hay un
were
espacio muy
absolutely
grande
terrible. I think that there's a
que
huge
contempla
space in order
una
for this
receptividad
to gain this
que
level
debería
of
tener
receptivity that it should have in
la
order
transición que describí en
to
mi
make sure that
exposición.
to
Nuevamente,
allow the
muchas
transition.
gracias a ustedes
So
por
thank you very
el
much to
espacio,
all
por
of you for
la
this
atención
space,
y
for
por
the
la
academic level
transparencia con la que
of
siempre tenemos
transparency that you're
debatamos o que expongamos
that you're
nuestras ideas.
that you're allowing us
Muchas
to
gracias,
have a
doctor
debate.
Emilio.
Thank you,
Doctor
Dr.
Eduardo.
Emilio, Dr. Eduardo. I fully agree with Emilio in terms of his affirmations. I think that these restorative justice exercise in terms of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide is unique globally. It's been criticized because the expectation normally has been to establish prison time when we have restoration and with this type of reparation with more and less or with more or less determining factors, we it may consider a slight crime. So this is why it is important to carry out procedures and outcomes that should be serious, should be objective and proportionate. They should convey trust among the people globally, among the victims, that this is a response to criminal situations. So this is why the support of the UN is essential, but also making sure that we internally can comply with the different levels. So I will submit to Dr. Archila the new agreements among the different administrations in order to provide a basis or foundation to this articulation. We started from a huge progress with the PDET and institutional supply in order to involve the highest accountable and the non-determining participating participants in many of these projects. I think that pilot cases will be next. And then in terms of the reparation for those who are not as responsible, but who are also authors of these crimes. When the country and when the world start to see that those who have acted against the victims, the attackers, or those who committed atrocious crimes work with them, and they have inserted and they have enrolled in institutional programs of work with the reparation context, and if this is well accepted by the victims, I think that at that time uh, we will be involved in the most illustrative field of what the restorative justice can do and what the world can expect from this type of justice applied as a solution to armed conflicts and problems that are not international. What is simply the moment of applying the guilt or the culpability that will involve the restoration. If we do it as we expect to do it, right, both the government and the jurisdiction would be starting to write a lesson that for sure will be followed by other
Muchas
countries.
gracias, doctor Eduardo.
Thank you
Miquela.
so much, Dr. Eduardo. Michela, yours. The floor is yours.
Sí, muchas gracias. Seguramente dos puntos
Just a couple of
muy
points
ilustre al cual añadiría
that, and I would add
un pequeño punto.
a
Para
small
generar
point
confianza
to
de las
generate
víctimas y
trust
de quienes se
from the
benefician,
victims and by the Colombian
seguramente
society.
la
For
posibilidad de
sure, the
tener la
possibility to
misión
have a mission
va a ser un elemento importante, pero
the possibility of having the mission will be an
otro
important element. But I think that
también
another
importante
important
a que
element will be
concentramos
the fact of
que el
concentrating
proceso
that
restaurativo
the
debe
restoration project
sea
of the
significativo,
sanction
en
itself
el
should be
sentido de que
significant
no cualquier
to the
proyecto,
extent that
no
not
cualquier
every
cosa
project,
puede
not
ser
pretty much everything
un proyecto
can
restaurativo.
be a
Se
restoration
necesitan proyectos que
project.
sean
We need
serios, que
projects that are
sean
serious,
que realmente sean
that
vueltos
can
lo que las
that
víctimas
become
están
what the
queriendo,
victims are wishing
lo
to
que
do,
un paciente
or
puede
what the
hacer
appearing
en un
parties
difícil
can do
balance, pero
in this
definitivamente que
difficult
sea
balance, but
significativo,
it
como
should
por
be
ejemplo
significant.
la acción
For
contra
example, the
minas, el desarrollo humanitario hacer
action
contra minas
against
en
mine
Colombia,
or the human
la
demining,
actividad
because
misma
the activity of the mining, of
como
demining,
de otras cosas, actividades que se
or
hacen
of other
alrededor de
activities
la
that are
acción,
carried out around
son
this action
simbólicamente
they are symbolically, they're changing the situation um, due to the different victims. So the international community, in my opinion, can play a very interesting role in this regard in order to determine which are the projects that are most significant and most important. And that way, we they can provide support to the effort of Colombia, as Dr. Archila mentioned, in terms of the effort towards transition. Thank you to our three panelists. I think that it's been a very interesting conversation that is worth continuing. Thank you so much, and I will pass the floor to Christine. Thank you, Maria Camila. Well, obviously, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists for your interventions, very pertinent as well. To me, that was a very interesting conversation. We understood the complexity even better, but also the depth of this system of own restorative sanctions, which are not just novel for Colombia, but at a global level. And to me, again, this conversation has worked the intensive work that has been done in past years and which is currently being executed. I mean, this is a very important long way to go, but this is an impressive work. And I think that it is really important to look at the joint efforts of the different entities, the state, the HIP, the UN. I would say that they are all represented here in this panel. So that the mechanism of sanctions can be implemented. And we hope that this collaboration and the permanent dialogue continues in the future. And of course, I would like also to mention that you can count on the continued support of Switzerland to make sure that this historical agreement can be achieved in Colombia, but also that these tools and this system, this novel system of the sanctions becomes a model for other countries. So my gratitude to Maria Camila, the moderator. Thank you so much for supporting us and for leading this panel. And thanks to Judge Eduardo Cifueste, to Councilor Emilio Archila, Michela Paulini from the UN, and have an awesome afternoon. And we will meet back very soon. Thank you so much.